Three, two, one. Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Arden, and welcome to Monday Night Live, live and uncut podcast with guests from all around the world. Today, I've got Michael Rendell. Michael's an old friend of mine. We met 35 years ago on a strategic management course at Henley Business School. Michael asked me not to say that. He thinks he's much younger than me, but I'm not sure about that. Michael was a partner in Michael was actually applying to be a partner, I think, when we first met in PwC, and he rose to a very senior partner in charge of the global HR consultancy, which actually turned over 8 million US dollars. Since Michael left, he's run a venture capital fund and a number of other issues, particularly on AI. Like some of us, Michael left school at 16 with a few O levels and become an accountant. Michael, I think you should tell us a little bit about your story. Give us a snapshot of that before we get into what's going on in the world now.
Yeah, and I don't want to, it was 8 billion turnover, not 8 million.
Did I say 8 million? A slip
Yeah.
of the tongue.
Yeah. So yeah, Michael Rendell, and great to meet you all. And yeah, Derek and I go back a little while. And yeah, we met at Henley Management College when I was going through the process to become a director at PwC at that point, and somebody said, "You're not very strategic." So they sent me off for 3 weeks to become strategic. And I met Derek and a couple of other characters. And I remember long nights down the pub, I seem to recall, was one of the key learnings there, being strategic down the pub. Anyway, yes, left school at 16 actually to become a professional motor racing driver. But I was not quick enough, and ended up working for the tax authorities in the UK, HMRC, for a few years, and moved from there into the accounting world, kind of poacher turned gamekeeper, or the other way around. Spent a little bit of time working for an investment bank, and then settled at PwC and became a partner at PwC. And I led, as Derek explained, their human resource consulting practice. And that was basically everything to do with an organization's people, the talent in that organization, right through from the sort of the most esoteric pension structuring. How do you account for pension liabilities in 50 years' time, right through to how do you develop leadership? How do you mentor? How do you coach? How do you spot the next CEO? All of that. Towards the end of my time at PwC, I spent a lot of time working on the future of the professional services firm. And it's interesting that there are sort of so many accountants and lawyers on the call, but what's the future of professional services? And that led into a whole variety of different things. How do we How do we train people? How do we develop people? And one of the things that we started to do was to think about the impact of artificial intelligence. And when I was doing this 10 years ago, it was the very embryonic stage. Chat GPT hadn't happened. And one of the projects that we started as a bit of an experiment was we built the first artificially intelligent consultant, a machine that could practice to the same standards of competence as somebody that had been in the firm for 5 years. That was our objective. And we tried to pick the most complicated subject we could find. So we settled on financial service regulation. And we built an engine that was able to listen to natural language questions, do the primary research, and then come up with a hypothesis about the answer. So doing the work there of a basic consultant. And I took away one lesson from that, which was as we rolled it out, the people that really liked it were the people who are most directly impacted. So the people that had been in the firm for 5 years, the new graduates, they were the ones most affected, and they were the ones that said, "This is brilliant. This allows me to do more work." Because it takes away a lot of the sort of the tedious stuff, allows me to do more work. The people that were most frightened and most opposed to it were those kind of the old guys, the old lags, the ones who've been around for 20 to 30 years, who started to see the power that they had by knowing stuff starting to erode. So that was whereas I thought it would be the other way around. I thought the younger group would be more worried, and the sort of slightly older people would be more content with this change. But it was very different. Anyway, that's what I did. I left PwC, decided I wanted to go and do something slightly different, and myself and 9 other partners left. We set up a small venture capital business, investing in technologies that were transforming professional services. Did that for a couple of years. That sort of morphed into a consulting business. And we sold the business to a Japanese technology firm, And ultimately, we sold it to some guys in the Middle East. And I left, decided I'd kind of done enough, and now do some consulting, do some investing, sit on a few boards, kind of enjoying a slightly different pace of life. So that's what I'm currently doing, but with a big focus around how AI is changing the world of work, particularly in that knowledge worker segment. That's my focus. Also got a little investment fund we've just set up, which invests in the infrastructure that supports AI, not the technologies, but actually the wires and pipes as we describe it. So, Derek, that's what I'm doing at the moment. And you very kindly asked me to come along and have a bit of a chat about. We're going to talk about, I think, about how AI is changing our world and some thoughts about what my perspective is of that. Does that, Derek, is that the right introduction?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Michael. Thanks for that. And amazing what you've done and what you're doing. So lots of questions come out of that, and I'm sure we'll get some questions in the chat box. Now, when we talked about this last week, and you kindly came on, decided to come on the show, agreed to come on, we talked about how is this industrial revolution, the AI industrial revolution, if that's what we can call it, different from others. Where do businesses fit in? How much is that going to affect people in the HR world? And thirdly, what is it that AI won't be able to do? The emotional intelligence side of it, the negotiating, the sales, the people skills. So they were the three issues. And can you take those one at a time for us?
Yeah, sure. The lots of conversation about, the Industrial Revolution, Industry 4.0, huge amounts of information discussed, lots of podcasts, lots of YouTube channels talking about, okay, so what is this change? Isn't it just another iteration? I think for me, this is the most significant change to human activity in the last 2000 years. And I don't say that lightly. I think this is such a significant shift in the way we as human beings behave. All of the other changes that we've seen over those 2000 years, the various, whether it's the steam age, whether it's the invention of the internet, whether it's all the things that go around that, all of those things have simply amplified human effort. A great statistic I love to put out, 120 years ago, there were 12 post deliveries in London. So
12 a day.
you could write a letter first thing in the morning inviting somebody to dinner. It would be delivered and you would get their reply and they would turn up for dinner. Okay, so it's that's 120 years ago that was happening. Now, the internet, of course, email, WhatsApp, all that goes with that, has speeded that up dramatically. It all now moves at the speed of light, but it's only speeded things up. The steam engine, and Derek, you and I chatted about, the train and the revolution around the steam train. That changed things, of course. To get from I don't know, Texas to New York by train probably takes you now what, 5, 6 hours? Don't know. Anyway, who would go by train? But if you think back, the train would take you a little while to get from Texas to New York. Well, if you were going by horse or you're walking, it would take weeks. But all it's done is speed that up. What this AI revolution has done is it's substituted human cognition. AI is different because it performs the work of judgment. It analyzes, it spots patterns, it designs, it predicts what's going to happen. And those were always previously thought of as things that we as humans did and nothing else. No machine was able to do that. So what it's done is it's starting to replace much of what we would regard as the value that we had as humans. It's starting to replace that. It's not just augmenting our muscles, it's starting to do some of the creativity that makes us distinct and different, makes us the top, the apex predator, makes us the most successful species. Some of those things, our ability to think and organize and spot patterns, suddenly this technology is doing that for us and around us, and sometimes without us even noticing. So it moves that disruption away from muscle work to thinking. And that for me is a very significant change. That I don't think has happened in the last 2000 years to people. So, it's a massive, massive shift in the way we've got to think about it. And I don't believe we've yet even scratched the surface. We're building autonomous systems that can sense, can listen, can see, can smell, can touch. We're building those autonomous systems that can do that, take in all of that data, and then make a decision. That's a very, very new world that we've entered into. Um, it also scarily scales at near zero marginal cost. The biggest constraint on AI and its ability to compute at the moment, the biggest constraint is energy, electricity consumption. These data centers are huge, they're hugely consuming of power. The biggest constraint is power and creating enough power to be able to power these data centers. And it scales, as I say, at near zero marginal cost.
Now, that sounds like we should be worried, but you're a very positive person. Where's this going?
Um, so the dangers, I don't believe the dangers are the sort of Skynet Terminator. It's going to take over and decide that we're a virus and we're not needed anymore. Although some people talk about that as it becomes self-aware, will it suddenly decide that we're nothing but trouble, then why bother with the humans? I don't think that's the problem. I think, the problem falls into four big areas. One, there's a crisis of comfort. Actually, it's really easy to rely upon this technology. As human beings, we're actually designed to be lazy. The best way to live for a long time is to be lazy. And actually, if you make things too easy for us, we fall into this crisis of comfort. We start to become lazy. We stop striving. We stop pushing the boundary. And I think that's a risk there. We kind of become, what's the expression, fat, dumb, and happy. Second, there's a little bit for me about actually we become a group of human beings that rely upon sound bites. You can tell when AI has written something. The words look pretty similar, a lot of sound bites. We talk about this kind of TikTok generation. If you can't put it into 30 seconds, nobody's listening any longer. And I think that's sad because the ideas that we create and the things that we as human beings envisage and imagine and the stories that we tell are complex, long, have subtle messages. And if we distill it all down to 30 seconds, we lose a lot. I mean, this podcast, I'm sure you've all used it. There's a very simple program, Notebook LLM, where you can take a 200-page book, 200-page PDF document, and it will produce a podcast for you, a 20-minute podcast explaining the highlights of that 200-page document. And you can listen to that, you can watch that, two human beings talking to each other, AI generated, not real, and you get a podcast. And it takes 4 or 5 minutes for this technology to create your podcast. And it just takes the highlights. It's actually what's going to happen to the detail. The trust, the technology is not perfect. It makes mistakes like human beings, but we as humans expect machines to be perfect. There's great outrage and debate going on about autonomous cars. Um, and the first time the autonomous car crashes, people are outraged. Good God, this machine has killed somebody or injured somebody. This car is not. Well, of course, the number of human beings driving cars, the crashes are 1,000-fold greater. But we've got to recognise the technology makes mistakes. We've got to learn to live with that. And the other thing, and going back to Derek's opening comments about football, actually part of being human is the ability to make mistakes, and we learn from errors. But if we're suddenly creating technology, whether it's VAR or all the other things that we're building, that we expect never to make mistakes, a little bit of the spontaneity goes out of our life, a little bit of the value of being around. So I think those are for me, the four risks. It's too comfortable. We end up with a world of sound bites. Trust doesn't exist or gets undermined. And also we lose a little bit of the spontaneity because we don't expect it or allow it to make mistakes.
So the second question is, how do us as human beings add value to society and to the world when we're being taken over by AI?
Yeah. And I think that's a great question. And I sort of phrase it a little bit, What are the things that we as individuals are able to do that the machine can't or can't do as well? The trick is not to try and compete with the technology. The trick is to ask good questions, to treat the technology as a super smart, well thinking, organized, and knowledgeable assistant, to have a dialogue, to challenge, allow it to challenge you, have a discussion about a particular subject. And the premium skill for us humans is asking the right question, asking better questions. And our value shifts from knowing things into making sense from things, spotting the signal from the noise. Um, when I first started doing tax, it used to be people would pay you a lot of money for knowing what the tax rate in Venezuela was. Yeah, people would ask for that. You'd write them a long letter, and at the end of the day, it would be whatever, 17.3% or whatever the number would be. Nobody pays you for that anymore. They could look that up very simply on the internet. So nobody pays you for what you know any longer. They pay you for how you interpret it, how you apply it, and how you extract the message from that knowledge. I think that's the skill that humans are brilliant at. We are great at making judgments. And judgment for me is the ability to make a decision based on imperfect facts. Machines are brilliant when you've got a perfect data set. They're much better at the logical decision. If you know everything about a subject, they're better at making the decision if you know everything. If there's a gap in your knowledge and you've got to make a judgment, machines aren't good at that. We're good at that because, again, 100,000 years ago, when you were walking down that path in the jungle and you heard a noise, you might not know exactly what that noise was. And you had to, in a microsecond, you had to make a decision as to which way you jumped. So we're good at making those kinds of judgments. Another one, the fireman in the burning building, and there's lots of stories about this. The fireman in the burning building, seemingly without knowing it, turns around to his colleagues and says, get out quickly. And they all get out, and 4 or 5 minutes later, the roof collapses. And they say, Jim, why did you say that? How did you know? And he says, I've no idea. I just sensed it. And actually, what it is his years of experience. He probably smelt something, heard something, recognized a little breeze, and he says, okay, I better do something. And he jumped. And that's what we're good as humans at doing. And that's, for me, the art, the spirit that we should be enhancing and building upon, that ability to make judgments based on imperfect facts. But don't try to become more AI. Don't try to find out more. Don't try to be more logical. Try to be more human. That's the way you compete with the technology.
So I know one of the questions which you're going to get asked, and I'm going to ask it now. So, what should our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren be studying? Because going to university and studying something that AI knows all about is not going to be a good investment of time, money, or resources.
Yeah. And we still need, because at some stage, somebody's going to have to be building the technologies that support, they're going to have to be building the data centers, etc. So we still need, as human beings, we still need to have that technical knowledge. But I think, that's a great question. What should we be teaching the young people going to school and university or to any other higher learning? There's definitely, for me, something about how do those questions work? How do you ask questions? How are you prepared to have a dialogue, a discussion, a debate, and a challenge? I think we've got to teach that. That's the real skill. I've got the three C's. We've got to imbibe them with confidence, so they can challenge and ask questions. We've got to teach them how to collaborate with others and collaborate with the technology. And collaboration is an often overlooked and much abused term. How do you collaborate? How do you enter into, and I'll come to negotiation in a second, Derek, because I think that's really important. How do you come to those win-win conversations with somebody else where you're working together to a common purpose? So collaboration, I think, is critical. And then also, how do you connect well? How do you build social networks and how do you build connections with other human beings at a human level where you can talk to people at a human level? Um, and I think, and I don't really think I've answered the question about what we should teach, but I think there's also something about encouraging people to understand where they add value in the chain. Where do they bring value into the conversation? Um, so yeah, I think it's confidence, collaboration, and connection. What particular subjects? I don't know. There's smarter people than me who we need thinking about what the subjects are that we should be teaching, but it does need to be within that framework. I spent a little bit of time, Tim, spent a little bit of time at Harvard, and that way of challenging and having a dialogue and a discussion in the classroom rather than learning by rote is really powerful. And we need to encourage that from five, not when you get to university or you get to a good business school. We should be encouraging it from five.
Wow. So where does that leave universities? Graham Jones is one of our members, and he comes on every 3 months and talks about Buckingham University, where he's in charge of the business school. But where does that leave them? They're moving pretty quick at Buckingham, but I know some universities are pretty slow off the mark and have huge debt.
Yeah, I'm a little worried for that whole sector. I mean, you can see you can get a distillation of every single lecture that's ever been given and has been digitalized from, I don't know, Stanford or Oxford or Cambridge. You can get that distilled in your mobile office for free. So what's the value in sitting in an institution for 3 years, paying whatever the number is in the UK or the US or anywhere else around the world? What's the value that you get from doing that, this imbibing of knowledge? I worry about what the future of that university segment is as AI is changing the way people learn. I think we'll see a far more personalized learning program. Everybody learns in a different way. And actually, this technology, this digital world, this AI world allows us to learn in a different way and to personalize and have people take knowledge in different ways. Whether that's some people really love the classroom, they love the interaction. Other people love to do it at their own pace. Other people, again, happy sitting quietly and reading on their own.
Can we move on to the communication skills? In fact, you talked about the three C's: confidence, collaboration, and connecting well. They're things that have been disappearing because of emails, because of WhatsApp, because people won't pick up the phone, because people won't go to networking meetings. There seems to be the younger generation seem to be a bit scared of that, the TikTok generation. How do we get around that? And you mentioned my subject, negotiating. You mentioned Will Kintish's subject, networking, Godfrey's subject, communication. He's trustee of a school, etc. Where does that fit in?
Yeah, and I thought of it definitely in the context of negotiation. And suddenly is the world shifting to a point where you don't need to be a competent negotiator. You just kind of set your AI engine to talk to their AI engine, and they'll come to a sensible mediation based on the kind of logic of the case. But I just think negotiation is one of those deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained human skills. Again, we go back 10,000 years. If you were not a good negotiator, you didn't get to eat. If you weren't prepared to compromise and if you didn't demonstrate empathy when the big person arrived at the fireside and you didn't get out of their way fast enough, you were not suitably submissive, you died. So it was pretty serious that you got that right. That's a very deeply ingrained human skill. It's not just an information exchange. Again, Derek, you and I spoke about autopilots on commercial jets. As two commercial jets are flying over the Atlantic, approaching each other at the same height, actually the transponders on the two aircraft negotiate. And they say, well, actually, flight A, you should descend 1,000 feet and I'll climb 1,000 feet. And that happens. And 99.9 times out of 100, that's all that happens. Nobody even realizes. So the technology negotiates. But at point one of a time, it doesn't quite work. There's some reason. So you need a human being in that negotiation conversation. It's not just about the logic. There's a piece around the human skill, the ability to hold the room, make eye contact with people, build some empathy. Um, and there's a great expression I've heard, and I heard it from Derek, this idea of empathy without surrender. You know, understanding what the other person is thinking and putting yourself in their shoes, but not surrendering and say, okay, I'll give you what you want because I kind of feel some sympathy and empathy for your position. So empathy without surrender. Um, and then this judgment word, at the very edge of uncertainty where you're not entirely sure, you've got to reach a judgment about something. You've got to make a decision. You've got to understand what you can afford to give away, which may be not necessarily perfectly in your interests, but you've got to give something away in order to get something somewhere else in this conversation. So, that judgment becomes really important. Trust. Trust is created by human to human conversations. Do we trust the machine? I don't know. Does the machine build trust with us? That would be a good question to discuss in the sort of Q&A session. Do we trust AI? We put our hands and our lives and our finances and everything else in the hands of the machines all the time, but do we trust them? So question whether trust there. Um, you know, the best negotiators will be those that use AI to support and guide them, potentially to be the red team or the blue team, to challenge them, to take them through the conversation, to throw the positions at them hard. They'll use it as a partner, but they won't use the technology to do the negotiation. So, I think the future is not about AI negotiating for you, but AI becomes a really powerful partner to sit beside you and sit on your shoulder as you negotiate, as you use the human skills to act as your guide, your mentor potentially, your calculator, your thinking engine, but not your decision engine.
It would be very interesting, wouldn't it, if we put the current negotiations that are going on in Iran and in Israel and in Ukraine into a model and see what it came up with. And of course, that would probably get thrown out by all six parties that we're talking about. Well, of course, there's more than six parties. There's probably 120 different parties into this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you could think about AI doing mediation in legal cases. Um, but again, you've got to be careful that you're not substituting logic for the cut and thrust of the decision-making process.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
Well, of course, in a mediation, the both you can come up with a deal, but both sides have got to agree to that deal, haven't they? And there'll be other emotional issues charged into those that decision making.
yeah. Otherwise, you get locked into a loop of logic, and actually, you never get to a conclusion because there's no perfect answer to these, and somebody has to compromise. And AI is not good at compromising, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. We nearly come to the end before we go on to the questions, Michael. But you talked about learning, knowledge, information. You talked about somebody called Mark Anderson, who I hadn't heard of, but you said he's the chief executive of the most successful venture capital firm, and he only reads three things. I think that's what you said. Can you
Yeah. Yeah,
illustrate that?
he runs a venture capital business, and Anderson and Horowitz in Silicon Valley, and they invested in many of the sort of startups and made an absolute fortune. And he speaks very powerfully about how you as a human now need to acquire knowledge. And he talks about reading three things. He listens to podcasts and reads blogs by some of the acknowledged experts, whether it's Jamie Dimon or Elon Musk, but just to get a flavor for what they're talking about. So that's what he gets. He spends a little bit of time on some of the social media platforms to gather sentiment, to understand what the sentiment is around a particular subject, not necessarily to gather technical skill or technical knowledge, but what's the sentiment? What are people talking about? And the third thing he does is he reads a lot of history. What's happened before, how's human nature applied to this particular subject. And that's where he spends his time and that's where he gets his ideas from. Very different to perhaps what you'd have thought about 20 years ago, where you'd think he'd be sitting on his Bloomberg screen, reading the Wall Street Journal, looking at the Financial Times. Um, Very much that let's listen to the sentiment, let's listen to the wisdom of the crowd from social media. Let's listen to some of the brightest and the best talking about their experiences, and then let's put that in the context of what's happened in the past. Because to learn about what's going to happen in the future, you've got to have a good understanding of what's gone before. And I thought, from one of the most powerful entrepreneurs in the world, that's a very powerful way of thinking about. And maybe that answers some of the questions about how do we help people coming into the workforce or coming into education? How do we help them to learn? Maybe there's something in that.
How do you think Warren Buffett and his team at Berkshire Hathaway fit into that and their investing?
Wow. It's interesting to see how the guard is changing at Berkshire Hathaway and kind of the new guys taking over. I think Warren Buffett has, he takes a very long-term view of things. And I think that's a very powerful way, a long-term view, and some of it lacks a little bit of logic. He likes to buy companies where he has an affinity for the brand. It's hard to put affinity into a logic engine. And definitely some of the investment that he's made over the last 30 or 40 years, if you applied logic, if you applied an AI engine to look at it, it would say, wow, that's a very, very dumb decision. Why would you buy X? Why would you buy Coca-Cola? Why would you? That's a very dumb decision. Why would you get into huge on retail stores? When actually the world's moving much more towards online. Why would you buy a whole load of retail stores? But again, proved to be a super smart, he had empathy for the brand, super successful.
Before we go to the questions, I'd just like to ask you one tip from you personally for 2026 and as we move forward, either for our guests on this podcast live or for people listening to this and watching this on YouTube or the podcast channels. What would your one tip be?
Um, Let me put before that a little. Have people heard of the Einstein paradox?
I've heard of it, but I don't know, can't remember it.
Okay, Einstein was an absolute outlier. And completely. If you tested him, if you were looking to employ him, if you tested him, he would be so far outside any bell curve that you would never hire him. And yet he was a sort of stand-up, total, absolute genius. So how do you find your Einstein paradox? How do you find the thing that's in the back of your mind, the idea that's there in the back of your mind that seems so completely crazy it could never happen? What's that idea, and how might you bring it to effect? So rather than dismissing it because it's so crazy, it's never going to happen, how might you bring it to effect? And the final thing, I spent some time at Singularity University in California, and we had a whole series of presentations of people looking for investments. And two slightly crazy, they're probably super successful, two slightly crazy individuals turned up and they were looking for investment in a brick making kiln. Not terribly exciting, but a brick making kiln. And we sort of probed a little bit and they said, this kiln makes bricks out of moon dust. We said, well, hold on, guys, there's not enough moon dust on the earth to make bricks out of. Why would you? They said, eventually man is going to establish a colony on the moon. It's going to be so much cheaper to take one of our brick kilns there and make bricks on the moon rather than take the stuff up to build the shelters. Now that's the kind of super crazy idea. Why? But then what's happening? In 10 years' time, probably we'll have a colony on the moon. Hopefully they'll be using these guys' kiln, and suddenly this crazy idea they had 15 years ago is suddenly starting to become something that will be of real value to humanity. So what's your Einstein paradox question, idea, the thing that's so crazy you'd kind of throw it out? Well, don't throw it out. Ask, how could I turn this into something that is real? Because AI and the technology around that speeds up things so dramatically gives you the power to do that now. So take your crazy idea and see whether that crazy idea couldn't turn into something real. That would be my 2026 tip.
Fantastic, Michael. Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close the formal part of the meeting and stop the recording, and I'm going to restart it because I think we'll have some really good questions for you that I'd like to capture. So, could I ask members of Monday Night Live to give Michael a vote of thanks in the normal Monday night way for that rather thought provoking and quite scary presentation of what's going to happen in the real world. So thank you, Michael, for that.